Hello, so today we're going to be painting one of my most requested paintings. It's called BC Sunset, and I think that you are going to have a lot of fun, especially with the sky. So before we get started, just a couple of things I like to go over. First of all, you can paint at your own pace today, so you can pause or rewatch anything that you may have missed. And if you want to get creative and tweak things or add things, go right ahead and make this painting your own. So just a few tools that we're going to need before we get started today. So I've got a canvas here. I'm going to use a 16 by 20 today, but you could use any size or shape that you have. You're going to need 5 colors of paint. So I've got my primary colors here. I've got phthalo blue, I've got a yellow and a red, and then I've also got black and white. And then you are going to want to have 3 paintbrushes. So I've got my big brush here. It's my favorite. It's a nice, just big flat brush. And then my medium brush. I like having one that has rounded, like a rounded tip on it, but a square tip one will work as well. And then something small that you can just do some little details with at the end. And then of course you will need some water and a rag so that you can rinse and dry those paintbrushes as we go and change colors today. All right, so if you are ready, let's get going. We are going to start by picking up our large paintbrush. And we're going to get some details up in the sky. So we're just going to go ahead and grab some of our blue paint right on the tips of those bristles. And then right across the top of my canvas, I'm just going to start by kind of throwing in a few of these little streaks. They're on a slight diagonal. Just a few blue streaks in there. And then what I'm going to do is I want to sort of soften and blend this and lighten it a little bit as well as I go. So I'm going to rinse out my brush. Just a quick rinse is fine. Make sure I dry it out. And then I'm going to grab white. And I'm going to take this white and I'm just throwing it basically sort of in between all of these blue sections here. Pretty heavy. I'm not chintzing on the paint here. I've got some good sized blobs going on the canvas. And you might see them start to change into light blue as you sort of, touch some of that blue paint. It will mix a little bit and that is perfectly fine. So I've got that in there and now I just want to start to soften and blend this a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of take my brush and just start going over top. You can use long brush strokes if you like a smoother look, or short brush strokes if you like there to be a little bit more texture. And you can really just play with this as much as you want. So maybe you want to stop really early on because you love how it looks, or maybe you just want to kind of keep playing, adding paint, going over it. Ideally, you just want to have your sort of brush strokes going on in a little bit of a diagonal here. So I'm just going to play with mine a little more. I like it to be soft, but still have some nice definition of dark blues and some lighter blues in there. When you think you're feeling happy with how that looks, we're going to wrap this color around our sides. So we want to make sure that we're framing our canvas so that when we're finished, we can hang it right up and it's ready to go. So anywhere that that blue has touched the edge, I'm going to kind of pull a little bit around this corner. I'm going to pull a little bit of this light blue kind of up the side here. And then right across the top of my canvas. All right, and then the one last thing that I want to do with this blue section here is just lighten it a little bit at the bottom. So just right where it ends, we want to have a nice sort of soft line here. We don't want it to be really harsh. It's going to make blending our other colors into it a lot easier if we really soften that. So I'm rinsing my brush out again, drying it off, just grabbing a bit of white on my brush, and then right on that seam there, I'm just going to take that white and kind of pull it across, work it in a little bit, so there's no strong line where my blue ends. And if your color was a bit darker, this might take a little more work. All right, that should do it. So it's just kind of a little bit more of an ombre rather than being a harsh line there. So again, I'm going to give that brush a good rinse because we are about to switch colors. So sunsets can have all sorts of different colors in them. I'm going to go into like a nice bright red or almost a fuchsia next. So I'm going to start out the same way. I'm going to take just some red paint. And over here on the left side of my canvas, I'm just going to throw in a few of those streaks. So just underneath the blue. And basically I'm going to come about probably halfway down. And I'm still following that slight diagonal. And you could pull this across more if you wanted. If there's ever a color that you love, you can use more of it for sure. So we are going to have yellow over here. So I'm just making sure I'm leaving some space. And I want it to sort of taper. So that's kind of why I've got the ends of these lines kind of tapering on a diagonal as well. The more red you put on, the darker and more vibrant your color will be. The less red you put on, the paler it's going to be. So it'll go a little more into the pink tones. Okay, so I'm going to just give my brush a little wipe rather than rinse it this time. I'm going to leave a little bit of that red in the brush, but just give it a wipe off. Grab some white paint. And again, just start to sort of put that in between all of these red streaks. And because I've got a lot of paint on there, I'm just giving it another little tap off on my rag. And now I'm just going to start to soften this the same way I did up here. So I'm taking my brush over top. I'm not worrying too much about how these two colors blend yet. We will get to that. Okay, and I don't want to overwork it because I do want to still have a lot of texture in there. So before I go too crazy, I'm going to just kind of assess things, figure out if there's little spots where I'm missing paint, where canvas might be peeking through, and just kind of fill those in. Get my edge. And now just to kind of refine this, I'm going to play with it a little bit more. And I'm going to pull a little bit of this color up into that blue section as well. So we want to be careful we don't get stripes necessarily happening up there, but kind of pulling little chunks of color up. And sometimes less paint on your brush makes that a little bit easier. But that's also something you can you can play and work with. The nice thing about acrylic paint is even if you did do like a blotch of red up here and you looked at it later and you really didn't like it, you can always paint back over it again once it's dry. So nothing's ever permanent. And as these colors mix, you might have a little wet paint still up in the blue. You might get little areas of purple, which can also be really pretty in a sunset. So that is nothing to worry about. Okay, so it is a very chunky blend. It's not your traditional, soft, smooth and blend, but we do have, these colors looking like they are supposed to be together and there's no harsh line where one starts and one ends. And later on, I might even put a little bit more blue and bring that into the red. We'll see how it goes. So I'm gonna let this dry a little bit. And we're gonna get to working on this yellow section here. So we do need to completely rinse that brush. And then we're just really repeating that same process. So grabbing nice big chunks of yellow paint, adding a little bit of white in between. Again, the more vibrant you want your colors, the more color you'll want to use and the less white you'll want to use. So I want my yellow to really pop and be bright. So I'm going to be putting a lot of yellow on and just a little bit of white in between here. And the other thing before we get going that I do want to mention is that when you mix yellow and blue, you're going to get green, which may not be a color you want in your sky. So up here where the blue ends, if that is still wet at all, you don't want to touch it just yet. So we're going to stop our yellow before we hit that blue section, and we can blend those two together a little bit later. So right now I'm just grabbing my yellow. I'm making sure I'm coming down at least halfway with these colors. We're going to be painting mountains over top, but we don't want to have like a white chunk of canvas in between our sky and our mountains. So we need to make sure we're bringing that sky down low enough. And since the sky is really kind of the main focal point of this painting, it's okay to have a lot of it. You could go down even a little lower if you wanted. All right, so I think I'm gonna kind of work with this for now. Start adding in my white. And I'm not too concerned, even though our red is still wet, I'm not concerned about those colors mixing just a little bit because orange, it's a perfectly acceptable sunset color, I think. So a little mixture in there is all good. Grabbing a little white on my brush. Starting to add that into these white sections of canvas. Okay, and then kind of softening everything out just a little. And then pulling some of this yellow now kind of into that red. So we want to make sure they overlap a little bit here and there. And here's where your colors are going to mix a little bit. if you do want to sort of pull, like we were pulling the red onto the blue, if you want to pull a little chunk of yellow up into your red, just mix a little bit of white and a little bit of yellow. Put that on your brush. And that'll just help it to show up, because if you go in with just yellow, you're just going to get like a solid orange piece rather than that nice vibrant yellow. Okay, you're just going to work this all up a little bit. Make sure that my paint is fairly thin too. It can be fun to add a little texture, especially into a sky like this. And if you've got the time and you can let it sit and dry, you can definitely do that and have like kind of chunkier bits of paint. But if you are going to try and paint this all in one sitting, then I would definitely keep that paint fairly thin just by spreading it out so that we can paint over top. Okay, and I've got this yellow section here. It's a little bit too solid, I think, for my liking. So I'm going to actually kind of grab a little bit of this kind of red, the touch of white, just a little bit on my brush. And I'm going to start to pull a little bit of that through my yellow just to break it up. Maybe not everywhere, but just really helps that red kind of melt into this yellow a little more. Maybe I want to even throw in some really bright red back into the pink section here. Just take a few minutes, play with that sky. Be careful of overworking things and making them muddy. If you do overblend, what can happen is things will just turn into kind of one solid color, especially if you've got sections where you've got two different colors together. You really want to be careful. You want texture, not muddiness. So play with it, but stop yourself every few seconds or so to just sort of look at everything, figure out if you're ready to stop, if you want to work a little bit more. And that will help you from kind of overdoing it. Perfect. Okay, I think I'm actually really happy with this section down here. I might add a little bit more white into my yellow. Again, just to get a little bit more contrast down at the bottom here. Get some lighter spots. And I may even, making sure I have a very clean brush, as I'm just playing with this, I might even go back up and put a little bit more dark blue kind of up at the top of my sky. So you can always go back and play with your previous colors a little bit as well. This is one of my favorite sky paintings. It's so much fun to just kind of play with it and get creative. Maybe even throwing a little more white up into the sky here, kind of maybe creating a little bit of a cloudier feel. So the only section that's unpainted up in my sky is kind of right in here, and I'm going to go back in there shortly with a little more yellow to just bring the yellow and the blue together. But I do want to make sure I give this a little more time to be completely dry so that I'm not getting that green happening. So while that's drying, we're going to rinse out that large brush and just set it down. And we're actually going to end up moving down into the bottom section of the painting. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get this lake sketched in, kind of get the shape, get our color ready to go. We'll finish that up and then we'll go back up and work on that sky. So for our lake, we are going to grab our medium paintbrush and we want to make a nice navy blue. So I'm just going to pull out a bunch of this blue paint here and I'm going to take a little scoop of black. So black is quite a powerful color. You're always better to have too little and add more. If you have too much, it can be a little bit hard to kind of backpedal that. So I've got a little scoop of black in there. I'm going to mix it up. And hopefully you can see that that is kind of darkening the blue up a little bit. It's getting a little bit richer. I'm going to go even a little bit darker. So I'm going to take another little scoop of black, work that in. We're just looking for a nice navy blue. So it is quite dark, but it's still blue. We don't want it to turn black. That's looking pretty good. Quick little, way of testing your color out if you're not quite sure. Just take a finger, kind of spread it out a little bit on your plate, nice and thin. And that's the color you're going to get on your canvas. So you're happy with that. Give your brush a little swipe. So kind of swipe one side, flip, swipe the other side. I just use the edge of my plate to do that. And that's going to take off excess paint. And when you look at those bristles and kind of look at them sideways, they should be pretty flat. You have lots of control when we're sketching in the shape that way. All right, so back up to our canvas. We're going to start just below our sky here. And basically, I'm just going to kind of sketch fairly straight across. And I'm going to go about 2/3, almost 2/3. So past halfway across the canvas. Just straight. It doesn't need to be perfect right now because we'll get a chance later on to really just make that line nice. And then from here, I want to draw in like a backward C. So it's going to be like a big hook. So I'm keeping the brush straight, curving, back, straight. So the most important thing with these backward C's is that this bottom line and this top line are flat. So we want to make sure we pull it back in flat, not angling down or angling up at all, as straight across as possible. And then we're going to do that again. So we're going to do a second C, backward C. So I'm coming back flat. I'm coming a little bit further back this time, and I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger. And as I end, we want that to be nice and flat again. And then the last one, I'm going to come back and I'm just going to let this kind of come off my canvas wherever it feels natural for you. So maybe it's off the side, maybe it's off the bottom. Maybe if your C's are a lot smaller, you might even have room to do a third one. But I'm just going to let mine kind of come back and scoop down off the bottom. All right, so this is our lake. So we're going to work on filling this in. We don't need to go all the way to the bottom, so you could leave yourself maybe 1 inch or 1.5 inches of white canvas down at the bottom, since we're going to be covering that up later on. But the most important thing with these brush strokes is that we are going just nice and flat, back and forth. If we start creating diagonals or wavy lines, our water's going to look a little bit less realistic and a little choppier. And I love the just calmness of the water on this one. So by keeping your brush just going back and forth, nice and flat, we're not filling it in 100%. We are going to leave a little bit of white. but we do want it to be mostly navy by far because we want our water fairly dark. So similar concept to the sky where we're putting in our color and then going to be streaking some white over top. But we don't need there to be much white to create texture, just a little. And don't worry about these edges here if you purposely, I'm just gonna go outside the lines, but if you get lines coming out like that, it doesn't matter right now. It's more important that you actually make it to that line. What we don't want is something kind of happening like this where we end up with a white border in there. So make sure that you are coming to or even crossing over that line. And while you don't need to speed paint to finish this step, you do need to move at a steady pace because when we add that white in, we want our navy paint to still be wet. It'll just make, blending those two colors together a little bit easier rather than if it's completely dried solid. I'm getting close to the bottom here, so I am going to just leave that bottom section white, but I'm going to pop in here and just sort of see maybe there's some spots where I want a little bit more navy added in. Like I said, we don't need a lot of white showing, just a little. And I also want to make sure that I've wrapped this left side here. Okay. So here's where we're going to add in that little bit of white, which is going to give our water a bit of a kind of a more dimensional look, a little bit more of a rippled effect. So I'm just going to wipe off that brush, grab white, and then swipe, just so there's not too much paint on there. And now I'm going to throw these white streaks right in where I can see the canvas peeking through. Still very, very flat, just straight across. Again, we want to go pretty quick with this so that the paint stays wet and we're able to blend it a little bit. Okay, so getting into my blending now. I am just wiping that brush off, taking the paint off, and now I'm just going to work it back and forth, kind of softening some of those white lines, keeping that brush stroke flat. So I'm just going back and forth, working my way down. And you can see that sort of softens a lot of those brighter spots. And you may not have full coverage at this point yet, and that's okay because we can go back in with a little more navy and just use that to fill in any bold spots that we're seeing where canvas is showing through. All right, so I've got, pretty much full coverage, but I do see those little spots of canvas. So I'm just grabbing more navy. And first I'm just gonna plunk the paint on. And then I'll go through and soften it again after. Still back and forth, keep that brush stroke flat. And that pretty well does it. Now I might have the like slight little bit of canvas peeking through here and there, and I'm okay with that because it almost gives a little bit of like a glittering or sparkling effect to the water. So now I'm just sort of softening those spots that I just painted in. Just quickly wiping my brush over top lightly, spreading that paint out. And then if you just kind of lean back or take a step back away from your painting, make sure you're happy with the like the tone of your water. If you want it a little bit darker, you could just let it dry slightly and add more navy in. If you want it to be a little bit lighter, you could add a little more white streaking into it. But for now, I think I'm going to leave it the way it is. Just missed a little spot right there. Okay. Double check you've got your edges done. And this is completely dry up here now, so I'm going to switch back up to my sky and just finish that off. So I'm going to rinse out that brush. And from here you can decide, maybe you want to bring a little blue down or maybe you want to bring the yellow up. I think I'm going to go with yellow and bring that up. So I'm just going to grab a bit of yellow here and white. Kind of a nice bright lemon tone. Just start to fill in the empty spot there with that. And then in order for it to blend, I am going to need to get a lot lighter. It needs a lot of white. So I'm just grabbing a blob of white here, tapping that into the bristles. And then again, I'm just kind of overlapping that blue a little bit. Pulling a touch of that yellow up into it. And this is your sort of your last chance. You can play with it a little bit more if you need to here. And I am using just my medium brush, but you could switch to your large brush if you prefer. Either one will do the trick. And I might even grab just a little hint of this blue and just kind of play with that a tiny little bit down into the red here. Okay, that's it. I'm leaving that sky. I like it. I'm not going to touch it anymore, even though it's very tempting to keep playing. So sky's done and water is done. So next we sort of need to work on some of the ground that's happening in behind. So we've got some mountains in behind. We're going to have some mountains down the side. And then later on we'll get into our rock and our trees. So we'll start sort of in the background. We're going to do these mountains that are sort of off in the distance. So medium brush. Spin my plate around a little bit here, and I'm just going to go in with like a really dark gray. So I don't want them to be solid black. because my trees are going to be black and I want to still be able to see the tree against this mountain. It should pop out a little bit. So I'm going to grab a bit of white and mix that into some black here. Just to get a dark gray. We're not going for any pale colors. It's still pretty dark, but you should see difference between your gray and your black. Okay. Doesn't need to be a significant difference, just subtle will work. All right, and I'm gonna swipe again, swipe, swipe, getting off that excess paint, flattening out those bristles. And now here's where it's really important. You need to overlap your sky with this paint so that you don't have any white canvas between sky and mountain. So I'm going to start over here on the left side, and I like to have a slight shake to my hand, almost like I've drank a few cups of coffee and I've got that kind of caffeine shake. That'll just kind of texturize your rock a little bit without having to think too much. And one thing when you're doing mountains that you can try to avoid is that perfect triangle peak. They don't actually have a perfect triangle peak if you sort of look at a mountainscape. So they're rocky, they're bumpy. There's going to be ups and downs. I'm going to come down a little bit here, still making sure that I've got yellow paint above my line. And then I want to come down basically to the length of my lake here. If there's anything you want to change about that, like maybe I want to make, I don't know, another little peak over here. I am going to make sure I wrap that around the side. And then basically we need to just fill this in. And as we're doing that, it's easier if you've got an outline. So right across the top of the lake here, I'm gonna get that nice, smooth, as straight as I can, line in. So right across the top here. And I have a shake naturally, so I don't like to do one big solid smooth line. I like to do little sketchy lines and just try and keep it as smooth as possible. And smooth it out a little bit if you need to after. Perfect, and everything in between those two lines, we're just going to fill it in. Okay, so one last little detail that I like to add into this mountain is a little bit of almost like a fog or a mist just above the top of the water. So I'm going to take that same brush, give it a little swipe off on my rag here, grab a little bit of white paint, and then I'm going to kind of swipe that off. Again, just not a lot of paint. And I'm going to come up just above my water and just kind of brush that across, and then move up and keep brushing it across. Just soften it a little bit. All we're looking for is sort of a slightly lighter gray and maybe even slightly streaky effect. You can add a little more paint if you need to, just above the water level. And then you can kind of blend that up a little bit into the mountains. Again, so there's no like harsh lines happening. It's subtle, but it looks really pretty. at the end, especially when your tree's kind of coming through that. Perfect, so rinse out your brush, give it a good dry, and we're gonna work on the mountains that are coming down from the side here. So these ones are gonna kind of overlap these mountains, and then they're gonna work into all these little crevices that we've got down here, all these little points. So I'm gonna start up here. I'm gonna grab just straight black this time. Swipe, swipe. Maybe I'm gonna go just like a touch higher than these mountains. Create whatever shape you're feeling. Again though, kind of use those shaky caffeine hands. It'll give you a little more texture. Heading down to overlap these mountains right in this area. Make sure you've got color in there. If there's white canvas, we don't want to see white canvas right in between the valley of these two mountains. Some overlapping sky color. And then I'm pulling this down towards the water, where it's going to stop and swoop back across the top. And now I'm going to outline all of those C shapes that I did, but again, remembering that all of these lines where it sort of comes in, we want to keep that as flat as we can, and just like this, try to avoid angling it down or up, nice and flat. So I'm just going around that C shape, and then coming in nice and flat, pressing really light. That'll give me a nice thin line. It'll kind of actually taper this mountain down a little bit. Back out. Around the next one. Really flat across, pressing light. Back out and down. Perfect, so all we have to do now is color this entire area just with solid black for now. We will get a little more texture in there, but we're gonna do that later on. So a nice thin layer so that it does dry pretty quick for us. But nice full coverage. Okay, so now that it's all filled in, I'm just gonna kind of smooth it out a little bit, especially if I've got any blobs of paint, just to help it to dry a little bit quicker. And then I'm making sure I also wrap that edge. All right, we have almost painted the entire canvas. We've just got a little spot left across the bottom here. So let's go ahead and fill that in. So it's just gonna be almost like a rocky shoreline down at the bottom here. So I'm grabbing more black paint. Swipe, swipe. Same process, kind of that caffeine hand. I'm just gonna create this uneven, rocky bottom that goes all the way across. Kind of using maybe some sharper angles now. Again though, we want to make sure we don't have any white canvas above this line, so you're overlapping water. And that's just going to end up meeting the other black section, and you'll fill everything underneath in solid black. That's it, we've kind of painted the entire canvas. All that's left to add on are just a few little last minute details and of course our trees. But before we do that, you will want to kind of flip your canvas up and just paint right along your bottom edge as well here. And that should completely cover and finish your frame. Okay. All right, so while this is drying a little bit, we're gonna do just a few last minute details in our water here. So I'm gonna rinse this brush out really well. And basically, I'm going to add like a little bit of water sort of splashing up on the rocks. Now, if this paint is still really wet, if you can see blobs there, you might want to give it a little bit more time to dry, or just kind of hit it with a hair dryer to speed up that process. Because otherwise you might end up with your water looking a little bit grayer rather than white. A little bit of gray is okay, but we don't want it to get too dark and murky looking. So right in these sort of C areas, I'm just going to use my medium brush. I'm going to grab a little bit of white, kind of tap off the excess, and then I'm going to use my plate to bash the tip of my brush a little bit to try and work some of that paint in a little further and let those bristles kind of just sort of spread out a little bit. And then sort of in the bottom quarter part here of that C, I am just going to dab lightly. Just a little bit, just so it looks like there's a little bit of that splash happening as the water is hitting the rock. Same thing, make sure for the next one I tap off extra. Find a clean spot, give it a couple little bashes on the plate. Don't be afraid to overlap right into the rock as well. And there might be just a tiny little bit down there. And if you want to add any other like bright spots into your water, like maybe you want to accentuate some of these a little tiny bit, you could take your small brush with a bit of white, really swipe it off. You want those bristles thin. Press super, super light. And you could just enhance them a little bit by just adding in this like kind of very delicate but nice bright white area. And I wouldn't overdo it. Just a few. All right, so I love sky. I love the sky in this painting, but my first love is painting trees always. So we're gonna paint these trees in. Basically, it's a two-step process. We need a trunk, and then we need to get in all the little branches. And these are nice, like skinny trees. So you have an option here. If your medium brush is nice and flat, the bristles are nice and flat and new, you could use that to do your trunk. The benefits of that are that medium brush will hold more paint and you'll have better luck kind of doing it in one stroke. If your medium brush is a little bit fluffy though, doesn't get nice and flat, you could use your small brush. You won't be able to hold as much paint, so you might run out part way up. But either one will do the trick for you. I'm gonna go with my medium brush, and I am gonna wet it a little bit. So I'm putting it into my water jar, and then grabbing some black paint and giving it a good swipe. That little bit of water is just gonna help that paint go further. So I'm gonna do two trees. I'm gonna do one a little smaller, one a little taller. I'm gonna start with the small one here on the left. And the other thing too with trees is just remember, nothing in nature is perfect. They don't have to be perfect straight lines. They have a little bend or curve to them or a little lean to them. All good. So when I'm doing my trunk, my small brush or my medium brush here, it's got two ways I can use it. I can paint flat like this, or I can turn it and paint on the edge. I'm going to use the edge. It's going to give me a thinner line and give me a little more control. So I'm painting with the edge of my brush, starting right down on my rocks. And I'm just going to press light and kind of drag up as high as I want it to go. Now it's a little skinny. Skinny's good because you have the option of making it thicker. It's better to have it too skinny than too thick. But it is a little too skinny right now, so I do want to thicken it up. I'm going to leave it nice and thin up at the top here, but kind of part way down, I'm going to press a little harder and just run my brush back down that trunk. Press a little harder down to the bottom. And that will naturally just kind of give it that thickness that gets a little thinner as it goes up. And I'm going to do one tree at a time. So I'm going to finish this tree off and then we'll do the other tree. So there's your trunk. Now for these branches, I'm going to try and show you this on a plate here, just so you've got two visuals. So here's my trunk. All right, and then for the branches, I'm still using my medium brush. I am swiping off the extra paint. I'm going to come up near the top and I'm just pressing kind of the tips of my bristles down and dabbing. And then I'm just going to kind of dab out one way, maybe out the other way. So it's tiny little fast dabs, dab, dab, dab. And I'm just going to work my way down. And the really important thing that I love about trees is that they're not symmetrical. So I'm not going like this and going straight across for each branch. It's a little more interesting if each side doesn't quite match up. And the less you think, kind of shut your brain off, the easier that is. Dab, 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 and you'll create this natural tree shape. So I'm going to do that up on the canvas now. And if you want to practice this before you hit your canvas, you can practice on paper or anything you've got handy. Just give it a few goes, and then when you feel confident, you can hit up the canvas. So right at the top here, I'm just, again, kind of pressing just the tips of the bristles right across the, almost at the tip. And then I'm going to come down a little bit. Our branches at the top of this tree are really short. Don't worry if you get like little blobs of paint in there. Just work with it. Rather than trying to sort of fix things up, embrace what happens. It can be a little wild, even if some of your brush strokes don't connect. It all works. So I'm just going to keep working my way down. I'm still doing fairly short strokes. The branches are definitely a little longer than they were at the top. I'm kind of covering my trunk too as I work. There might be spots of it that you see. The other thing too that I forgot to mention is keeping this handle sort of pointing down towards the floor. It will help. It'll give your brush a little bit more contact on the canvas rather than keeping it up straight. And you'll get a little more texture. So I'm just going to keep going right down to the bottom here. And then can kind of have a look if there's anything else you want to add in there. Any branches you want to make a little longer or a little fluffier, but don't overwork it. Usually your first run through is pretty good. If it looks a little sparse, add in a few more branches. And then I'm going to do that again. So grabbing a little water, swiping in my black paint, and then using the edge of my brush, I'm going to do my next tree. Pressing really light at that top. And then I'm going to come in and thicken that up a little bit by kind of pressing a little harder as I work back down. And same process for these branches. The tip across the top. And then just kind of dabbing my way down, going back and forth a little bit. Sometimes your branches they could curl up a little bit at the end. They could slightly curl down a little bit. Or they could be straight. All different kinds of pine trees. Getting those a little longer now as I start to come down. Still keeping that handle brush, or the brush handle, pointing towards the floor. As I get down to the bottom too, especially in this bigger tree, my dabs become much, much heavier. They're not as dainty as they were at the top. There's a lot more paint kind of going onto the canvas. It's a lot more solid. All right, that will do it. I've got a little splash over here. Just wipe that off. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to rinse out my medium brush. And the last few details that we want to do is kind of texturizing these areas. So the mountains here, the rocks at the front. So with that medium brush, I'm going to make sure it's as dry as possible just by using my rag. Soak up any water. I'm going to grab a little bit of gray. So we want to make a gray that's maybe just a touch lighter than black here. So I might even try this gray that I've got made up already and see if that works. What we're sort of looking for is a subtle highlight on our mountains here. We don't want it to be like bright and in your face. We want to be able to see it, but just a little bit. So just to kind of test this out, let's see. Okay, so for me that would actually be pretty good. I might go a little bit lighter, but so that you can see what I'm doing, I'm gonna go even lighter than you should go. So I'm gonna add a little more white to mine. I just wanna make sure that you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, and once you've got that color mixed, you're gonna scrape as much as you can pretty well off your brush. Kind of use the edge of your plate or palette there and just wipe lots of that paint off. You want to see those bristles very clearly through the paint. And I'm going to start on the top of my mountain here. And again, caffeine hand, we're shaking a bit. And I'm just kind of creating an outline, but a really messy, sketchy one. The messier the better. We don't want any defined lines here. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So this little inlet right here is going to be another mountain. So I'm going to maybe start up here and just kind of start creating the shape that's going to come down into that point. And then again, one more time, up here. Hardly any paint on the brush. Right down to that point. And then just kind of using this to sort of smudge in some little texturized spots. Really just anywhere in there. If at any point you think, oh, we went overboard, I did too much, just take a little bit of black paint and you can go right over top and just erase some of the smudging. So don't be afraid of it, just give her a try. We don't want lines necessarily, but just a bit of shading in there for texture. And then same thing across the bottom here. So again, I'm just gonna kind of very, very sketchy, but kind of go back over maybe a little bit of that rocky outline. All the way to the edge here. And then maybe just a little bit of smudging down below. Again, just kind of adding in some texture. Okay. Rinsing up my medium brush because I am finished with that one. One other thing that I'm going to add in is just a couple little birds up in the sky. I'm going to do 3. I like odd numbers. So I am going to use a bit of black paint with my small brush. And I'm just going to swipe that off again so that the end of my bristles are nice and flat. And then pressing very light and just using the very tip of my bristles here. I'm going to come up and I might do a little bird up here. So for birds, I just kind of do V's, sometimes an M. So that would be a little V. Or an M. And they don't all have to be the same size. Smaller ones are a little further away, bigger ones are a little closer. And that's it, guys, we're done. So that is BC Sunset. One last step though before you do completely decide you're finished. When you are happy with everything, make sure you sign that painting. And until next time, I hope you keep painting and we'll see you soon. Bye.